Hey there, I'm Lee Ullman here with some big news from the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're partnering with Heritage Radio Network on a special season of The Farm Report. It's all about what's happening with the Farm Bill and how it impacts farmers and eaters.
I am growing diversified vegetables on land that's been in our family for 150 years.
And so with the pandemic, gentrification, property values going up, we had to sell the land and we lost it.
Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind this massive piece of legislation that shapes how we grow our food, what we eat, and so much more.
The problems we have had, those are things that come from earlier Farm Bill and USDA policy, right? Like Earl Butts, get big or get out.
You know, it's my responsibility to know not only what I'm eating, but then like how that all came to be. And realize like, wow, like this piece of legislation, all this money, like it's technically something that I support as a taxpayer.
While Congress debates the next Farm Bill, this is not just an invitation to listen. It's a call to action. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network, wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Hearst Ranch, grass-fed beef raised on California's Central Coast. Now available online through Larder Meat Company. Learn more at HearstRanch.com.
This week on Meat and Three, we dive into the science behind munchies, the history of coca, the therapeutic powers of psychedelics, and mushroom-infused recipes.
One of the biggest questions we get asked a lot is, does heat degrade psilocybin?
The coca leaf was used as a sacred plant. So as a plant that could communicate human beings with gods or Mother Nature.
What you can start to appreciate here is that cannabis is activating and hijacking the system throughout the body.
Tune in to Meat and Three, HRN's weekly food news roundup, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on the Heritage Radio Network. It's November 2020. It's Cider Week NYC, and in the midst of the pandemic, I've got my favorite cider, Eve Cidery, joining me remotely from way upstate New York, and we're here remote recording at heritageradionetwork.org. So I want to quickly introduce my guests. Just a little backstory. These really are some of the top, cider maker right here, world class, putting New York cider on the map. And I'm very proud to have you guys. In 2018, we awarded you the second annual Scion Award for Cider Week NYC. And I'm so happy to have both of you here. So let's please introduce yourselves, both Ezra and then Autumn.
This is Ezra.
Hey, Jimmy, thanks so much for having us on the show. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Great. So it's Ezra Sherman and Autumn Stoshek from Eve Cidery. So let's just do a little backstory for our listeners. This is Cider Week episode, and we love hard cider. It's that time of year for hard cider. Way back when you tell us just how you got started, Autumn. You what did you do? You had someone else's farm and you started cultivating apples or planting apples, and one day you went to Steve Wood in Farm Hill and you got some cuttings. Take me way back.
Yeah, so I was working on an apple orchard in 1999, the year that Steve Wood was the Fruit Grower of the Year in a trade magazine called Fruit Growers News, which graced the bathroom of the employee bathroom where I worked in the orchard. And that year I read about Steve, and it was a story about how he was, sort of market in New England and had gone and had seen these crazy orchards in England where his wife had relatives and they took vacations, and learned that the apples in England are being grown for cider. Well, this just kind of blew my mind because I was also waitressing at the time at night after I worked all day on the farm, and just getting into the world of wine and just sort of beginning to understand that there was specific grape varieties that people grow to make specific wines that grow in specific places, and it seems like such a cool world to explore. And so when I read that article, it just sort of connected two of my loves. And I think the way I remember the story is that I didn't even call Steve. I like got in my little Dodge Horizon and drove up there unannounced. And which is kind of weird, but I guess I'm a sort of impetuous person. And Steve was very gracious and tasted me through his cellar and made me spit and and gave me a bunch of cuttings to take home, which was the beginning, and if I had known at that time how long that journey would be and how much work it would take, I surely would have been put off. But because nobody else was really doing this back then, there was nobody to call and be like, oh, what is this? How do I do this? And what does it involve? I just sort of like dove in head first, and I guess haven't really stopped.
Well, it's 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration for anything good. So, yeah, so keep going. So, you found a farm. I really want to know the backstory because I've had Ezra on a couple of times. I've never really had you for the whole show. So I'm feeling really lucky today.
Well, I hope I live up to your expectations. Ezra's the better storyteller because he'll tell you all the terrible disaster stories that we've had that are self-deprecating and very funny. I mean, so it's a long and winding road, and I think it might not be that interesting to talk about every single little detail. But one thing I would say for sure is that when we first started out, when I first thought about wow, maybe I could try to make a little business and do this. It was based on the idea that we would open this sort of tasting room at a U-Pick orchard, the orchard that I was working on, James's orchard, because we already have these customers. They're coming out here, and there's all these apples that don't get picked in the orchard or get graded out of the packing line when it gets packed for fresh fruit and all of that stuff. And that's how the idea started, and it's evolved like completely in another direction from that, because I think that's probably a good idea for an orchard. It's probably a good business model for a U-Pick orchard, but at the end of the day that like the interest or depth in that is very superficial, and it's not something that's going to keep you inspired and engaged in making cider for the rest of your life. So where we kind of turned and headed into a different direction was when we started getting into fermenting and realizing that the varieties that are used in cider, it's so important, and that's what it's actually all about. And that it's not varieties that we were growing that were bred for fresh eating, when they were fermented, were rather insipid. And that sent us down, a path that turned it into just such a big, long project because, as probably your listeners know, I mean, an apple tree, it's a perennial crop. It's not an annual crop. It takes a long time to get an apple off of a tree, from the time that you have the idea that you want that apple, to the time that it's growing and producing in an orchard. And so, the oldest orchards we have that we planted are now they're going into their 21st season.
Well, going into the nitty grittiness or whatever of the sequence of events, that orchard that you planted 21 years ago, how did that correspond with what were you doing 21 years ago when you planted that orchard here in Venneton with your dad?
It was basically, I was still making cider at the orchard, or like, thinking about starting the cidery at the orchard. But the cyan wood that I got from Steve, what I did with that was I went into James's orchard. He had this row of, it's going to come to me. It's funny, these things that you remember from like so long ago. Vistabella. It was an apple called Vistabella. It was an absolute disaster of an apple that got ripe like in the middle of August and tasted like styrofoam, then immediately dropped off the tree and started rotting.
There's a certain niche for you pickers.
So I think James was like, you can have that row. And so in the early spring, before, right before the apples bloom, we cut all the branches off the apples with these trees, fairly large trees, just leaving the trunks and some small branches, and took the cyan wood from Steve and grafted it into the cambium tissue of those trees. And that made trees, that had a root system of a 30-year-old tree or whatever it was at the time, that pushed all of their energy into these little sticks that we had grafted onto them. And so it grew a bunch of fresh wood of the new variety, if that makes sense. And so once I had done that, I had this source for more cyan wood. And I think, again, in that sort of like, well, I'm so impetuous. I didn't own any land. I didn't even have the business at that time, but I thought, well, my next step obviously should be to make a bunch of trees. So James's brother, Steve Cummins, owns Cummins Nursery up here in Ithaca. And so I asked him, well, could I have a row in your nursery to stick some of these trees? So he taught me how to bud, which is a summer form of grafting, where you stick the bud in the cambium tissue. Once the cyan wood has gone dormant in August, mid-August, but the cambium tissue and the rootstocks are still slipping. And so I grafted up about 300 trees of these cider varieties: Ellis Bitter, Bulmer's Norman, Medaille d'Or, Bramley Seedling, so on. And then I think I just said to my dad at some point, maybe at Christmas, like, are you ever going to do anything with that hayfield, on the bottom hayfield, the really steep one, like, because I've got 300 trees and I have no place to put them. And so I don't know how he thought that was, I don't know. I guess he was.
But Chris has always wanted to be a farmer. and yeah.
The things dads do for their kids.
And then Ezra, what's your take? Were you there at this time? What's your take on these early days?
I think your question about like the sequence of events is kind of interesting because there is a bunch of twists and turns to this story. A lot of people have heard about I don't know if a lot of people have heard, but I think Autumn's and I've made the connection with Farnham Hill a lot about in regards to their support and Autumn's unannounced trip there. But there's been a lot of moves and drama in the kind of time leading up to, I guess, the very moment that we're speaking in a way. But I don't know, was it like a few years before I met Autumn, James had a traumatic brain injury, and Autumn was, I guess, still trying to make it work at Little Tree, which is the U-Pick that James owned right outside of Ithaca, but he was completely incapacitated, and there was a kind of untenable situation with his ex-wife and her husband at that location. So I think I dropped in to help with a bottling there at Little Tree because our parents our mothers are friends, but I'm like 12 years older than Autumn, so I never knew her like growing up. But I was interested in winemaking, so I had heard that she needed help, so I came.
No, our mothers were trying to get us together for years.
You were like, since Autumn was 7.
Oh, stop it.
Just kidding. So, like she always makes that reference. I mean, like, whatever. She's teaching our kids the history of hip hop.
Is that something called a dowry?
Yeah.
Dowry.
That's supposed to be funny.
I don't know.
But
my parents.
Let's move this on. Keep going. Okay. So you guys, it took how many years did it take you from the time you first went to Steve Wood's until you planted those 300 trees and you were actually harvesting apples from them?
Well, that was kind of the point that I was going to make originally, which is to say that like, because we started making cider right away. Like after I visited Steve, I was like, oh, wow, I'm going for this. I went to England. I took a class. I made a little business plan. And I think maybe the next fall, I bought some apples from Steve Wood, like many people have done when they start their cider businesses. And I also, pressed some apples at the farm and opened that next spring at the U-Pick orchard. So I guess my point was sort of that, like, because then right around that time, those trees went into the ground. Well, we didn't harvest anything off of those trees for another 8 years. Think about that, 8 years. Now you can get a crop somewhat sooner with more modern high density planting systems, but I planted these on semi-dwarfing trees and trained them to center leader, and
it was unfenced.
And but 8 years, that is the reality of planting a perennial orchard. And so even though we've been had a cider license since 2000, this journey of planting trees and planting more trees and harvesting the fruit from them slowly and increasingly, and learning what the different varieties do on our site, and what we thought we were going to love and don't like and have to tear out and plant new stuff, and what we love and didn't plant nearly enough of and are planting more of, and so on and so forth. It's really sort of mind-boggling, and it's a long project that's probably longer than we have, certainly.
No, it's a whole amazing story. And let's jump ahead to like 2011 was when the first Cider Week New York happened. And I remember I was lucky enough to be there in the beginning in New York City. And it's probably when I first started tasting ciders like yours. So where were you at in 2011? And what were some of the first ciders, or the ciders then that you were selling in New York City? To jump ahead, you can give me some backstory. Pick like 2 ciders that you were selling in 2011 or 2012.
Well, in 2011 and 2012, we were selling Autumn's Gold, which is a blend that we've made right from the beginning. That is, our idea, sort of like our translation of, how do I say this? Like a new world, an American version of a bittersweet cider, a classic bittersweet cider that has always had, a large component of bittersweet apples in it. And I remember this probably, we used to sell at the Green Market in New York City. And that's really how our business actually ended up kind of getting its start and getting its footing. And back probably before 2011, before Cider Week started, we were in business for 10 years before that. And we were selling cider by literally giving a taste to every single person.
In New York City.
Every single person who ever bought a bottle from us tasted it first because they had no idea what it was. And this is something that Ezra and I laugh about. It seems so funny now, but like people had in their minds, it was so ingrained in their mind that cider is, like cloudy, unfiltered juice that you buy at an orchard, And so people would come up and they would taste it, and our ciders are, almost all of our ciders are really dry. And it would be a bone dry cider that is naturally sparkling, made with a champagne method. And they would
in a champagne bottle with a champagne cork.
And they would love it. And they say, "Oh my gosh, this is so delicious. Does this have alcohol in it?" And you'd be like,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's such a different time because, there's a part of it that was really exhilarating because it was really like, people were, here's this new thing. I've never heard of it. I'm going to try it. Wow, I like it. I'm going to buy a bottle. I'm going to buy a case. I'm going to tell my friends, whatever. And I remember when Peter Hoffman would come through the Green Market on his bicycle. And of course, I had no idea who he was. And he said, he came and he tasted and he said, I'm going to take a couple of bottles, but maybe next week you could come and drop a case off at my restaurant. And I think my mom came and did market with me.
Really?
Maybe the week that I did that. And
cool.
And so we went down there and I was so nervous and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a real restaurant in New York City. And the cider is on the menu, and we sat down at a table.
Oh, you sat down at a table
and had a cheese plate with the cider.
This is at Savoy.
Yeah, that was at Savoy.
Oh, that is cool.
And I said, like, whatever you do, Mom, don't say to anybody like what's going on. I don't want to do that. But yeah, that really was a thrill, and that really was people like Peter, and restaurants like Gramercy Tavern that bought cider and put it on their menus before 2011. That was a big piece of the puzzle of cider coming together. And then, yes, of course, the first Cider Week that Sarah Grady organized, and I believe we had the trade tasting at Jimmy's number 43. No, is that true?
Yeah, that's why I was lucky just to be part of the whole thing. I think nobody else was willing to sponsor and host the trade tasting. And I was like, I'll do it if you don't have anybody in the whole city. And that's what happened. So that's what I met.
And that was amazing. It was amazing. And it was
and
a really great example.
Since we're talking that time, yeah, it was that strange. I mean, earlier that year, Sarah Grady from Glenwood had hosted a Cider Week organizational meeting, and she just brought together in one room what you would do if you were doing anything in the city with industry. She had some restaurant people, some beer wholesalers, some wine people, and some experts. And nobody, other than a few of the bigger cider companies, there was nobody who really knew anything about cider, and she put that together. So it for me that's when it all started. But for you guys, back in the late 2000s, so when you were selling at the markets, who else in your area? Because I want to steer this towards the Finger Lakes a little bit, just to talk about how special your region is. Who else was also making serious cider in the late 2000s near you?
There was Bellwether at that time. Other than Bellwether,
I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you exactly when everybody started, but I know when we first got our license, because I remember like there was Bellwether and there was like maybe one or two other, apple wineries in the state. I remember that because it was like this confusing thing at the time. What's the difference between cider and apple wine? And so there was like the two of us, Bellwether and us, once we got our license. And I think when I looked a couple of years ago, there's like 80.
So the ones like Black Diamond, Redbird, they weren't making cider back then?
No, not when we started. No, that was probably, like you say, oh my gosh. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a timeline in my mind, but that was probably, like
in the early teens or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what was the license that you got first? I mean, was there a farm cidery license back then?
No. And we still have the same license. We have a farm winery license. Yep. The farm cidery license was a new thing that happened just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing how much has changed in a short time. Going back to your region, I want to talk about the Finger Lakes. You're not really Finger Lakes. You're actually tell us about what your little microclimate is. There's something special there.
Yeah, so the Finger Lakes is a very broad term. There's a Finger Lakes AVA for wine. There's a Finger Lakes as defined by like tourism. There's all sorts of ways to define Finger Lakes, but I kind of think of it as like a sort of a geological place. So when the glaciers came down, they came down twice, but when they came down and cut their way across this sort of like Devonian peneplain, which had, undulations and like a sort of, but a sort of like vague kind of gradual elevation. There was a sort of a watershed divide, if you will, that is still actually the watershed divide that exists today, more or less. And that is sort of right where we are perched. And so what happened, and that is essentially also sort of where the Appalachian Mountains, the Northern Appalachian Plateau kind of comes to an end and crashes down. And so what happened is as the glaciers were coming down from up north, they sort of stalled in their flow moving south in this high elevation point. And that's how they dug out the Finger Lakes, because glaciers are, like rivers of ice, and they're moving and they're churning and they're like digging things up. And so our orchard is sort of located in this kind of, we call it the Emerald Necklace. It's this high elevation area that sort of flanks the kind of southern edges of the Finger Lakes. It's hard for me to describe this. I want a map. I want to show people on a podcast. But yeah, it's really cool. And one of the things that I think is really cool about the Finger Lakes and why it's this really exciting region for growing apples is because within the Finger Lakes, there exists all of these really super diverse microclimates, because the geology is really like varied and unique. And so there's places where people are growing apples in glacial till, for example. And this is the material that the glaciers brought with them from New England and has like more limestone in it and a lot of granite and gravel and materials like that. And then there's people who are growing apples in sort of what I like to think of as the native soil, but the material from the shale that is the bedrock of this area that's just been weathered and breaking down in the spot where it is, and then there's people like us who are growing apples in some of each, because actually like on our farm, there's a glacial till deposit, and there's a cliff that a glacier cut off, and it has all the native material on it. And so really, really diverse soils. And then also, you can be down by the lake, and you can be, like 900 feet in elevation, 900 feet above sea level. And then you can be where we are in the Emerald Necklace. Not our orchard's about between 1,100 and 1,500 feet. But there's apple trees as high as 2,100 feet. So yeah, that's something I think that is just going to become more and more and more interesting about the Finger Lakes as there are more cideries, as people are doing a better job at explaining to cider drinkers like what is actually unique about their site and their terroir, as more and more people are growing enough cider apples to make single varietal ciders so that you can travel up this little route through the Finger Lakes and taste Kingston Black all of your way through. So there's a lot to look forward to and a lot that's going on up here.
That's amazing. So it's like Burgundy, where even different slopes make totally different wines. Just from your portfolio, so like, tell me one cider that's grown on, if you break it down by this, one cider grown on the glacial till soil and one that's grown on the native shale soil. I mean, if that's actually a good example.
Yeah, well, one cider that, we've done this a couple of times. We didn't do it this year, and we didn't do it last year, but I think we did it the year before, and I hope we do it again soon. Some of it's related to the biennialism of the trees, but Northern Spy is a great example. It's a really cool apple because it's really, really, really affected by where it grows. So you can be growing it in some places. It just gets this really sort of saline kind of minerally character. And then you can grow it in some places and it's really aromatic and sweet and like sort of pretty. So Northern Spy is a really good example of a cider that we grow very distinctly in both places and have made ciders from both those places in the same year.
And that same year, what's the difference between that same apple variety, Northern Spy, grown in two different soils? Is there anything obvious?
So I think that the cider apple, the Northern Spy apple, is grown on thin soils, native shale soils. The cider is more, it actually has more tannins, more sort of energy. It tends to have more like spicy kind of aromatics, and also like honey and waxy aromatics. The Northern Spy grown in the glacial till, and there's one variable here that's a little bit throws it off because those trees are quite a bit older. But those trees, the cider, I always find it to have like more body, like a lot more on the mid palate. Almost as if it's like almost if it has like a viscosity or something, like it's like thicker, and also more like fruit forward characteristics. So
well, that's great. So now I'm going to jump around with you guys. So we know that it's Cider Week, and I've noticed that it's virtual Cider Week. It seems that some restaurants in New York City are featuring cider flights. I don't really know what else you can do this time of year. Is there anybody in New York City, Ezra, doing flights or doing any features with Eve Cider right now?
Not that I know of. I have to admit to kind of taking a break this year from Cider Week, and not pursuing like any like non-virtual events in the city. There's of course there's places that have our cider, but I don't know of any place that's doing a feature of
so
our
who has your cider right now, if you want to list a couple of places? Because there's still people doing things in New York, so
yes. There's still people doing things. I mean,
yeah, totally. I mean, hold on for a second. I've got to refresh my memory, but keep talking, and I'll.
Yeah, well, so today, by the time you listen to this, it might be a couple of weeks, but today, the state just announced that all liquor licenses have to stop serving at 10 p.m. And we are just very thankful that so many restaurants can still be open, and the outdoor dining's really been successful. I love your stuff, and I would feature it if I were open. I know Huertas on First Avenue in the East Village. It's one of my favorite tapas restaurants. They're doing a flight with Metal House, which is from upstate. But I think I should just place you guys as really being in this creme de la creme of cider as a fine beverage. I'd really like to let people know that if you really want to, if you see an Eve cider of anything, it's going to be dry, it's going to be wonderful. You might have an ice cider. I mean, there's not too many others that you could recommend across the board. And it's from New York State. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio.
This episode is brought to you by Hearst Ranch. The Hearst family has raised cattle on California's Central Coast since 1865. Today, Hearst Ranch's signature product is their 100% grass-fed, completely hormone and antibiotic-free beef. The Hearst Ranches have always treated their animals with great care. Their cattle live a completely natural existence as foragers and grazers. Well-managed grazing fertilizes the land naturally, sustains a seasonal rhythm to the ranches, and produces a remarkable meat whose flavor is the authentic taste of the American West. Hearst Ranch beef is available seasonally, May through August, in select Whole Food markets throughout California, and all year round at their retail locations in San Simeon and Paso Robles. And now, HRN listeners in Arizona, Nevada, and California can get Hearst Ranch beef delivered right to their door through Larder Meat Company. Go to lardermeatco.com and shop the 100% grass-fed box to stock your freezer with Hearst Ranch beef. That's LARDER, meatco.com. Learn more about the storied history, farming practices, and conservation efforts of Hearst Ranch at HearstRanch.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on the Heritage Radio Network. It's Cider Week NYC. We have a special recording with Autumn and Ezra of Eve Cidery up in Finger Lakes, Van Etten, New York. We're talking remotely. And big shout out, heritageradionetwork.org. Become a member. So Autumn and Ezra. So just some basic questions. So I'm a young person, and I want to learn about making cider. So I'm going to show up at your farm for Cider 101. What would you have me do? What would you have me do tomorrow? Like whatever you're doing tomorrow and the next couple of days. I want to hear like the schedule on the farm this time of year. What are you doing?
This time of year. Well, so one of the reasons why Cider Week is like so intense for cider makers is that we like literally just finished our last press over the weekend of the season. And that's like it's just a super intense season where you don't catch a break and you've got to get everything harvested and pressed and racked and into barrels or into tanks and get the fermentations underway and do it all before the weather turns and the apples freeze and you lose your chance. So we've actually just been like for the last, I think 3 days, we've been like sleeping because it's the first time we've been sleeping. Like literally, I think we slept 10 hours last night. So totally. I feel like I could sleep forever. And so, yeah, we're like in a little bit of a transition point right now. We're just like trying to catch up and like regain our vitality and our health and stuff. And what's going on in the orchard is that we have a certified organic orchard. And so because of that, we need to put tree guards on the trees so that the mice don't eat the trunks over the winter because, we don't put like poison in our orchard or anything like that. So there's a little bit of like, tucking the trees in and putting them to bed. And then they're going to sleep right now. So they're just going to go to sleep and we're going to, let them rest until we start pruning probably in March. And in the cidery, what's happening is we have probably about 32 different batches of cider going. It's all natural fermentation, so I monitor it pretty closely. I'm checking it, every several days and making sure that the fermentations are going the way I want them to be going. And we we started making some pet nat, and that's something that basically you're going to be bottling the cider before the primary has finished, so that you can capture, so that it can continue to ferment a little bit in the bottle, and you will capture the carbonation that's created from it finishing the fermentation in the bottle. And that's like kind of a fun one because you got to catch it at just the right time. So I can't tell you when that's going to happen, but we're, paying close attention because we're moving towards that.
So Autumn, how does that do? So we all know pet nat from raw wine, natural wine. How is it doing with your products?
I think I really love a cider pet nat as something that is really fresh. It's really like vibrant and fresh, and I think it goes really well particularly with some of the more like really tart and acidic varieties. And we also make a pet nat out of wild foraged fruit, which tends to be really tart and so I like that kind of that fresh, raw, like super bright and zingy flavor profile in a pet nat cider. And yeah, people have been like exposed to a lot of pet nat like through the natural wine movement, and so they're really open to trying it and liking it.
And is your pet nat cider, is it something that it reaches a certain point and you have to drink it then, or can you hold on to it? No, it's similar to your others.
I opened a bottle of a pet nat that we made last year, and it's it's a natural product, and so it was definitely different than when I was drinking it in the spring. I feel like I was drinking it in the spring, and it was like the sun is coming out, and everyone's feeling so cooped up from the pandemic. But it's like fresh and bright, and it had like just a little bit of residual sweetness to it to offset that. And then when I had it on my birthday a couple of weeks ago, it had gotten quite a bit drier and like more creamy. So yeah, it changes, but it's not gonna, that is in fact part of the deal, is like you need to really be right on with the specific gravity when you bottle it, because you certainly would not want to make a mistake and create a bomb in a bottle. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah. And then I just want to ask the obvious question: from your work in the orchard and going way back 20 years, how did you learn about cider making? Was it trial and error? Did you take a course? Was there anyone giving you tips?
I think that's a really good question, because we get that question all the time now from people who want to, start making cider. And
I don't know how many people actually are doing it who went through like an enology program.
I know.
It feels like people are like also starting without degrees, the people who are interested in like starting cideries.
Yeah, and we learned so much, and I actually have to really give Ezra credit for this, because he was just so
unself-conscious.
Yeah, really.
That's my attribute.
But that's one of the things about the Finger Lakes cider industry has been very influenced by the Finger Lakes wine industry. Eric Schatt of Redbird, worked for Weimer, and we certainly got a lot of mentorship in the early days from other Finger Lakes winemakers. So, there was that, and there was, tasting and drinking a lot, and really, really, really refining a vision for ourselves about, what we were aiming for and what we wanted to make and what we sort of like put on a pedestal and idolized. And there was also, we've never been afraid to throw cider away. That's certainly like one of our strengths, I guess.
Right. I mean, we've made so many, but anyways, I mean, just to give credit, I mean, there was like probably always like 3 people that it seemed like there was always like a last minute crisis that one of us was calling for advice. And they're just going through my mind now. Some were, winemakers that for whatever reason we felt like we had a personal enough relationship with that we could ask for like nitty gritty advice. And then there was a few people like in industry, not like production industry, but like manufacturers who were available to us in companies that, I mean, they just really gave of themselves. And it just seemed like at that time there were so many things where we were just like, what is going on? I have no idea why is this happening
and
to me?
I mean, a lot of what we were doing, we were inventing, quite frankly, because this is a new industry. You know what I mean? This is a new thing that people have been making cider commercially in the U.S. And
I mean, I think of the things that we did. I mean, it's insane, and we just had totally also for the scale of production that we were doing, we're doing now actually, but there wasn't really a model that we could look to. There was like, that's a good point. That was the problem. I think there was the commercial production facility, with like a full bottling line, automated bottling line. And then there was like equipment made for the, for the, what do you call it? The hobbyist, the home brewer. Yeah. And we use that equipment, to a certain extent.
Yeah. Like just to point this out, I think, in case any of our listeners don't know, but like, we started this business. I started this business with money like I made from waitressing, which, will give you an idea of what we started the business with. And so, every tank we bought, at the end of the season when we had, made the money from the cider. And so that is like that is one thing about, because, people thought about starting wineries and having investments and, with cider, I think almost everybody I know in the Finger Lakes has done kind of the same thing that we have, because it's so new and it's such a gamble. And it's like, how do you have this little business and actually, make it efficient for production without buying a bottling line, for example. So.
Well, then jumping to styles, because those are other choices you have to make when you're trying to save your business. I remember that the first year or two of Cider Week, Steve Wood at Farnham Hill was adamant that he was only going to make still cider. At one point, did cider makers like in your circle kind of decide that you would also have to make some type of sparkling cider? Because I remember by 2015, every top cider in the Northeast had a really good sparkling cider, and then people were bummed because I didn't have sour still cider. So
we've been making sparkling cider with the traditional method, champagne style cider, since 2002 when we got our license. That's the first cider that we made, was Autumn's Gold, bittersweet apples with the champagne method. So that's always been kind of our main focus.
Jimmy, I do have information with regard to to get our cider in the city when you want that.
Oh, go for it, Ezra.
Well, the Grape Collective in Manhattan, PJ's, First Avenue Vintner, 9th Avenue Vintner, Riverdale Vintner, they've all been like really supportive of us for a long time. And Big Nose Full Body, Columbia Wine Company in Brooklyn. Columbia Wine Company is one that's currently selling us. The list of like bottle shops is definitely longer than the list of restaurants, I guess owing to what's going on in the city still. Dante, West Village, Silver Apricot, American Bar in Queens has a Sullivan Street Bakery, but definitely more bottle shops.
I'm going to jump around. So yeah, that whole style thing, it sounds like you figured it out in the beginning, and it does make sense. The shape of your bottle and everything is champagne worthy. I love drinking your ciders. You have some really good information on your site. Tell us about your philosophy of cider pairing. You said something about serving cider with peasant food.
Nice.
Where did you read that? Is that
on our website?
It's all through our website.
Look up Eve Cidery, cider pairing. There's some really good stuff there.
When did we start having a website?
I mean, cider, the way that I first tasted cider was in a farmhouse of a local couple, Peggy Hayne and Peter Hoover. Peter has since passed. Peter's was a real tremendous sort of cider enthusiast, and had influenced a lot of people in the Finger Lakes, and also probably inspired a lot of people in the probably everybody who's making cider in the Finger Lakes today was inspired by Peter Hoover originally. But I first had their cider, their homemade cider in their farmhouse with like just a basic fall meal that you would make in the Finger Lakes, like some cooked collards and roasted squash, and I think maybe a roast that Peggy had made. And I think that's like sort of this connection that I'll always have, because cider is inherently an agricultural product. And so I think about the peasants like us who are out there working on the land and taking care of the trees and stuff, and coming home at night to a bowl of soup and a crusty hunk of bread slathered with butter. And that is really like a natural food pairing for cider.
So hard cider is an everyday drink, isn't it?
I really think it needs to be an everyday drink. I think that every person, every person needs to have cider in their pantry, and that it has a place at the American table alongside beer and wine. And there are many, many, many occasions when cider would be, my beverage of choice.
Well, that's great. Now, a question more about going back to agriculture. We're going to wrap up soon. The other day I talked to West County in Massachusetts, Field Maloney, and someone asked a question which I found obnoxious, but it was about, your farming practices. Do you have any complementary growths? Anything that you're growing in or around your apple trees?
You mean like companion plantings?
That's probably a better term.
For example, we have comfrey in maybe 5 of our younger plantings in one of our orchards, interspersed with the trees. You were going to say something?
No.
Yeah. We've planted clover. I've just, it's like we do these things and I think to myself, oh, frick, that was a lot of work. But now like the clover has really taken off. You can see the strips just like right around the trees. Like the cider varieties drop, and we don't have Roundup strips down our rows for other reasons, because we don't use Roundup because we're certified organic. But you want a nice landing spot for the apples, and clover is a nice bed. Those are 2 that we planted. Yeah, go ahead.
That's a great answer. I had never thought of that. A landing spot. I keep hearing stories of people in your area who say, well, we're going into the national forest and we're fighting off the cows that are grazing on the apples or something. I know you've got a lot of great stories. I think this has been a really great show. This is definitely one of many we're going to do with you, because I just started tapping the surface with you guys. And the last question, I'm just, again, noticing some of the information you have. I still find it not as clear to me, but I know that some folk in the Finger Lakes are talking about regenerative agriculture. and some roots of native peoples in the land. How does that play out in what you're doing and what others in your region are doing? Like, what is it?
That's a really good question. And actually, do you want to make a plan to do a show on this? Because I'm like, I'm about to talk for an hour and a half right now. I know you don't have that kind of time.
Yeah, no, we will. But yeah, just give me the brief summary, because I think it was Melissa Madden who first talked to me about it over a year or two ago. And I was like, oh, you mean like just letting the earth go back to what it was, like no-till or something? I didn't understand the deeper meaning.
Well, regenerative agriculture and actually, I mean, I think this is something that I think a lot of my colleagues and us as well are just really starting to grapple with and understand the layers of context and meaning behind this. A lot of the growers in the Finger Lakes, and ourselves included, have been very, very dedicated to sustainable farming and, trying to take that to like better and better levels. And I, if any of your listeners are familiar with conventional commercial apple growing in New York State and the Northeast, you'll know that it is one of the most chemically intensive types of produce that is grown. And I came up in that. I was exposed to that. I worked in settings like that. I myself have personally sprayed many miles of Roundup in my life, and there's a whole reason like why that is, and I don't want to get too crazy down that rabbit hole, but I will say that between Cornell University and the whatever like Apple organizations exist in New York State, the message had been very clear for a very long time that it would be impossible to grow apples organically in New York State. And I think the cider industry has done specifically, I would say the Finger Lakes cider industry and the people involved in that have done a really exceptional job in proving them wrong. And that I think your listeners would walk into, our orchards, for example, and it would be like the kind of place that they would want to imagine being and taking their kids, and where they would see nature and butterflies and many different plants growing on the floor of the orchard, as you were mentioning. Those ideas, though, that we kind of like ourselves forged our way and like felt like we were inventing, indigenous people have been growing orchards, for many thousands of years without causing climate change, without, poisoning the rivers and the soil and degrading the topsoil. And so there's, something we're all grappling with, I think, especially in this time of, just sort of like collective consciousness raising around these issues is, regenerative agriculture isn't something that like white farmers just invented. And once you start going down that line, you really start thinking about, well, geez, like where is my farm actually located? And, whatever happened to that treaty, and, who broke the treaty with the Haudenosaunee, and like, what are we actually doing here? And I think that's a big conversation that's going on in our
I know that's going on where you guys are. So I'm going to follow up with you that in the winter was probably a good time to have a regenerative agriculture talk with you and a few others. So you guys are awesome. So let's do the quick run through. When I'm shopping for Eve's Cider at these great, mostly wine stores right now, but of anywhere, what's out there right now? What are some of the selections that are available now in the New York City area with Eve's Cider?
I would say right now, like especially with the fall meals that happen in November, I would really recommend Autumn's Gold. I mentioned it a couple of times. It's really showing beautifully right now. The 2019 version. It's a really rich tannic cider that also has a lot of like soft, beautiful, ripe, bittersweet fruit, and it pairs wonderfully with like a roasted bird and squash and all of that stuff. So that's what I'm like would advocate for trying. You may find a little bit of Northern Spy still left on the shelf, and snap it up because there's not a lot of it and it's going to disappear. And it's dry and chalky and lemony and like absolutely refreshing. It's delicious with oysters. And then, don't forget the Essence ice cider. Last year, we made our Essence, about half of the apples that we used in the Essence, we wild foraged. And so it's a really special batch. It's actually got these like gorgeous tingly tannins and a lot of acidity and like ripe red fruit, like rose hippie kind of fruit. And it's like a really special dessert to have right now in the fall.
Well, that's great. And everybody, thanks. Big shout out to Cider Week NYC, all of New York Cider. They're doing a great job. They kept all the Cider Weeks going in the pandemic. Cider Week Hudson Valley, Cider Week Finger Lakes, and Cider Week New York City. So that's about it. Thank you so much for joining me, Autumn and Ezra of Eve's Cidery. Big shout out to our producer, Dylan Hoyer, and engineer Matt Patterson. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host of Beer Sessions Radio during Cider Week NYC, and we'll catch you next time on Heritage Radio Network. See you guys later. Bye. Woo!
Bye.
Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like. Tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.